Linda and I are very happy that we can meet with you today, and Terry invited us to come. We live only 15 miles from British Columbia, so really we're just neighbors, right? But there's a few mountains in the way from there to here, as we found out. British Columbia is a beautiful place. You're very, very fortunate. We have known Terry and Jean for about 35 years and had the privilege of teaching 3 of their boys at our Wilderness Academy that we ran there at Polebridge for many, many years. We retired from that about 4 years ago after 35 years of teaching. We had a reunion this summer. Probably about 100 people came, many of our former students. In trying to find addresses for all of them and contact all of them, we discovered that there were 144 students who came to that school through the years. I think that's prophetic, perhaps. You know, for nearly all of human history, almost everybody on the planet lived in the country. It's hard to think of that now. There's so many huge cities everywhere, but that was true. Most of them, mind you, didn't do it because they wanted to. They were just hungry. And until the advent of modern mechanized agriculture, if you wanted to eat, you farmed, you gardened, unless you could find somebody else who would do it for you. And that's kind of what the kings and folks like that did. Some folks had beautiful country estates. I think of some of the ranchers and industrialists who came to the United States and into Canada early on. They had the money maybe to do that. I think in our own country, in the United States, Thomas Jefferson, who was the author of the Declaration of Independence, he had a beautiful home in central Virginia. It's still there, Monticello. He experimented with flowers. He had beautiful gardens all around. He had a lot of people to help him, but he loved that life. He was a very intellectual man. George Washington, who helped to win freedom for our country, also had a country home. I visited there, some of you may have, at Mount Vernon. It overlooks the beautiful Potomac Valley and looks off towards Washington, D.C. there. I actually got some of the ideas for my greenhouses at our place in Montana from him. Not that I'm that old, but in visiting there, he had a beautiful greenhouse, even in those days, and it's still there. I'll tell you a little more about that tonight, what we learned from that. And then I think of Ellen White. She was given ideas by God, I believe, about what would be best for God's people. And she tried to carry those out in her own life, but she didn't really understand the importance of country living in her early years. But when she went to Australia, she was hoping to get a school started there. And you know the story. But in looking for the land, some people thought she might be a little far out because the land they actually chose was about 1,500 acres. It was so far out in the wilderness there in Australia at that time, this is the 1890s, that there was no road to it. To get there, they had to float down a river to begin with. It was about 70 miles from the nearest town of any size, and quite a few miles from even the smallest little burg, kind of like, actually, I was expecting Cherryville to have several stoplights and all of this, and it's more like Polebridge than you realize. But still, 70 miles out, and you have to realize she was in her 60s. When she first went there, she was single. She was a woman. She was frail. There was no excuse. She knew God wanted His people to live out in a natural world. And if she didn't go there, who wouldn't go? Everybody else. She couldn't do all the work, and so she hired some of the young men to build her home. It was called Sunnyside. They planted orchards and citrus groves around her place. She tried to be an example to people ever she could. She came back to the United States about the turn of the century. And when she came here, she did the same. She tried to find land for what became Pacific Union College. And it's interesting to read the story about that. They ended up with over 2,000 acres. And she bought a small place nearby that you've all heard of. It was called Elmshaven. It was actually built by, I think, a Christian man. He wasn't an Adventist. And for he and his wife to live out in the country. It too was about 70 miles from the nearest large town, which was Oakland, San Francisco Bay Area. I can't remember now, just there were health issues and he had to leave. And so she bought this. It was about 70 acres. She's now in her 70s. She's still single, even more frail, and all of that. It had a beautiful spring called Crystal Spring that was on this property. She shared some of it with her son so her grandchildren could have a place to live in the country. She shared the spring with the new sanitarium that was being built nearby so that they could have good water. There were hundreds of fruit trees on this property. Now, how was this 70-year-old lady going to do all this? She knew she couldn't do it all, but it was no excuse because of her age, and so she simply hired somebody, and that gave that family a chance to live in the country with their children and so on. And she worked with him for a long time. And then I think of some of the great people of the whole planet. Think of Enoch. Think of Noah himself. Moses. Think of David herding the sheep. And his brothers weren't so interested in that work, but he was. And you think of so many other people down through the history of the world. John the Baptist is another. And then, of course, Adam and Eve, our first parents, that's where they started. But you know, most people who lived didn't have nice Adam and Eve type country homes. They lived hard scrabble lives as subsistence farmers, peasants, serfs, and worse. They were there, but they weren't there by choice. There have been two periods in world history when most people have lived in cities. Somebody guess what they were?
Pre-flood?
Well, we don't know, probably, but we don't know that. But we know for sure the Tower of Babel. When we'll talk about that here in a minute, a little more detail. But the folks, after the flood, they were used to an easy life before the flood, really, and they were looking for a better life. Anyway, they all came, and they said, we're not going to head out into this ruined world, because it was really ruined. And they went to where they could. Started building this big tower, and they all lived in one place. The whole of the Earth's population, with a few exceptions, perhaps Noah himself may have been still living up by the ark, we don't know, but they all lived there. And they forced people who weren't as well connected or whatever to do what farming they need to right around it, and the Lord said, this isn't going to work. It's the very problem that we had before the flood, and so you know what, He intervened again and confused the language so that people would scatter everywhere. When's the second time that most people have lived in cities?
Last 100 years?
No.
Actually, the last 4 or 5 years. Now, in our country, yes. But I'm talking worldwide now. We passed an incredible milestone just about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, when over half of all the world's population now live in cities, many of them mega cities, huge metropolitan areas. That's quite a milestone, and it's increasing all the time. I asked you this question, why do so many people like urban life? I don't. I'll tell you why here in a few minutes, but most people do. If they have a choice, that's where they go. Why do they like it so much? It's an important question we hope to answer today because it may help us with our ministry to people and maybe to our own families. There were three great institutions that were given to mankind by the Creator at creation. We usually think of two. The two we usually think of are what? Marriage and the Sabbath. And they were, but there was a third one that's equally important with the others. And that was the Eden home, which was intended by God to be an example for all people throughout history. It's also ironic that those three institutions are all under attack today in our modern society. Think of marriage. Even in our own Adventist culture, marriage is in trouble. There's a lot of immorality, broken families. And today, even the definition of marriage is under fire, as you all know. The Sabbath, really there aren't that many Christians in all of Christendom who honor the Sabbath, or even the substitute. Many people maybe go to church, but the rest of the day is really not the Sabbath. But even among Adventist folks, we have to realize full and true Sabbath observance is often waning, especially in the metropolitan areas. And how about that Eden home? Tragically, we just passed another milestone the last few years. 90%, this was in the Review and Herald, by the way, about 90% of all Adventists in North America now live in cities. Despite 100 years of incredible counsel, they still do. I've read many articles recently, last few years, on bemoaning the fact that we're losing so many of our young people. We are. And yet the major reason, the most important reason why that is true is never mentioned. And that seems so strange to me. This is actually a far more important issue, I think, than we have sometimes thought. And I was amazed this past summer, and some of you may have already read this, so I'm going to just be a repeat for you. But in the Sabbath School Quarterly, in the Teacher's Helps this summer, speaking about our families, there was an incredible statement. I want to read just a little bit of it to you and then comment. It was not in the full quarterly, it was in the Teacher's Helps, so some of you may have missed it. It says like this: families bear the image of God. This potential invests them with sacred and incalculable value. There's no church program or outside responsibility that should interfere with the personal investment it takes to maintain a healthy and happy family. Would you agree with that? That's the prelude. How many accounts must be shared from adults, and I know I'm stepping on a few toes here, but I didn't write this, who gave all their time to church work only to lose to the world their own children who testify of being neglected. Now, was that just a few? Stay with me here. But someone might respond that family sacrifices are necessary for evangelism and the saving of souls. To implode that illusion forever, and this is incredible that this author would say that, to implode that illusion. What illusion? That you gotta overlook your own family in order to reach the masses. Okay, to implode that illusion, this is what they say. Take note of the following account. Lee Venden, who some of you probably know who he is, tells of a conversation he had several years ago with a church leader who was, at that time, assistant to the president of the North American Division. This is his quote: "We were talking about an extensive NAD survey taken in North America, the results of which left one feeling as though they had the wind knocked right out of them." So what was this conversation? And how does it impact families? Probably the most startling revelation was that if, since the inception of the church, our church, the only, and that's in all capital letters here, the only growth in the North American membership had been biological, and if we had simply retained 80% of our own youth, the membership in North America at the time of that conversation would have exceeded 8 million. What's our present membership in North America? About 1.2 million. You know what, let that sink in. If we had never done any evangelism, held no camp meetings, we had never given one Bible study, and all we had ever done is retained 80% of the children of the original 3,500 members who started this church, there would still now be 8 million. When I read that, I was absolutely blown away.
So sad.
It is sad. And I know some of us in this room probably struggle with that. And I'm not stepping on your toes. I'm just trying to say, folks, that because in many ways we have not held to God's original plan that He had for humanity, and we've spent our money on what we thought was more important, we've often actually come up short-sighted because of that. Some of you want to read the rest of it, you can. I just took it out of that. This brings me to a couple important questions. How did this happen? It depends on what is called the law of unintended consequences. And here I need to tell you a kind of funny story. It would be funny if it wasn't so sad. I hope none of you are from California today. Recently, California tried to solve a problem that they have. They've had a terrific problem down there. It's actually growing, of homelessness. A lot of these homeless folks do need to eat, and they need some clothes from time to time, so they go into stores and they shoplift. It was small potatoes, really. They're not stealing the whole store, but there's a lot of it going on. And they were found out, they were arrested, and they were put in jail because it was a felony to steal from a store. It ought to be serious crime. And the jails in California became overcrowded. I'm sure you have none of these problems in British Columbia. So what to do? The legislature decided, really, we got to do something about this. Locking up a lot of these poor people that went in and stole a couple $100 worth of clothes. And so they passed a law. This was about 3 years ago now, I think, that if someone stole less than $950 worth of goods from a store at one time is no longer a felony. It was just a misdemeanor, for which there's no real jail time. It's not really a crime, hardly. It's a slap on the wrist. And so if a store sees somebody walk out with $400 worth of stuff and run down the street, they don't call the police anymore, because if they do, the police won't come because it's just a misdemeanor and you're not going to lock anybody up. It's pointless. So put that together with this. California's also decided that we got to save the planet. And one of the ways you save the planet, and I'm not opposed to this, is we just got too many plastic bags flowing around California. It's all over the beaches, it's all over town, everything. So they passed a law saying that no store, no place of business could hand out plastic bags anymore. And we all go to the store, and where do you put your fruit? And they give you a plastic bag, plastic or paper. You know how that goes. They can't do that anymore. What do the two have to do with each other? Now, when a person goes in California to a store, they take their own bag, and many of them take a backpack so that they have something to put in. It's a good thing. They're cleaning up the planet. So now when a homeless person walks into a store with his backpack, and he goes into a dressing room and stuffs it full of clothes or food or another place for food or whatever, he is not conspicuous walking out the door with a backpack, because everybody's got a backpack. You put those two things together and you have the law of unintended consequences. They never intended to have this huge shoplifting problem that they have now, and they don't know what to do. You going to lock them all up again? Before we try to solve that problem, let's get back to our own. The unintended consequence is we moved to town, or I leave my family every day to go to my job because I need money. And what I want to do is help my family, but in the end, I'm not spending any time with them, and I'm losing them. Unintended consequences of a wonderful decision. It was about 1900 that Ellen White was giving her most ardent counsel to folks to leave the cities and get into the country. In 1900, half of all people in the United States, and probably in Canada too, lived on farms. Everybody. And the half that didn't, most of them didn't live in the city. They lived in rural areas, but they no longer made their living farming. So why would she be giving this strong counsel when hardly anybody had the problem? And it's because our God can see the future. God knew what was coming. The whole world, particularly North America, was about to change wholesale. Nobody understood it at that time. God's counsel was ahead of its time. Industrialization, factory towns, world wars, debt, foreclosures, the Great Depression, it was all conspiring together to push people off the land and get them into a city environment. It was all coming. And so before that happened, the Lord gave us counsel to try to prevent it. Did it work? Well, they all went imagining that they were going to have a better life. And why did they want that better life? They wanted more money so they could buy nicer clothes for their children. Law of unintended consequences again. After World War II, things changed dramatically. The West had won the war. Prosperity came. Depression was over. And people literally wholesale, including my parents, flocked to the cities because that's where the money was, where the prosperity was. You know, I had wonderful, wonderful parents. They both passed away now. My father was a pastor. My mother was a beautiful pianist, like you. Helped my dad in the ministry. My dad had grown up on a hard scrabble 3 or 4 acre little farmette in central Iowa. He spent hours and hours, he used to tell me this, weeding the onion patch and the other vegetables because his family sold, you know, just a truck garden. They were poor as they could be. There were 4 boys in that family. He had some honeybees. He kept hunting. I could tell you all the stories. They were so poor. He grew up thinking of country living as drudgery, hard work. And when he got education, and most of the people were flocking to the city, and we're supposed to witness to people, not trees, and so, you know, most people just went with the flow. My dad didn't have any trouble of being influenced by the allure and the glamour and the glitz of city life. He hated it. He wasn't interested at all. All he wanted to do was preach the gospel. But he forgot, I was born in 1948, after the war. I didn't grow up on an Iowa farm. And all his values and his frugality and his being able to just walk downtown and see nothing that was evil and just on a mission, that didn't happen to me because I grew up in the city and it looked nice to me. That's what happened to literally tens and tens of thousands of Adventist people. It's pretty hard to develop a righteous character in Sodom. It's not so hard to develop one out with Abraham and then go in there and keep it. That's what happened to Lot, but it didn't happen to his family. So, why do people do it? You know, why were they doing it? Well, you know, even in China, Africa, and India today, South America, which used to be bastions of the undeveloped world, and everybody lived on a little tiny acreage because that's all they could do, they're flocking to the cities today. You've probably seen that if some of you who travel around the world. The cities all over the world are huge. Now often these people come, these poor people come, and they end up in what they call favelas in Brazil, or they end up in ghettos. And there's millions of them. They're living in filth and trash and all that. But their thought is, somehow I can get a job here somewhere, because just over the shacks where they live, they see the towering skyscrapers that beckon. And they're hoping to find a better life, and that's why there's only half now. So why do they do it? Well, they do it the same reason we all did: convenience. Lack of so much hard work. They want sedentary jobs, not jobs where you have to work hard in the sun. People are after money, and it's true. I found that out when I moved to the country from where I was living and doing as a teacher. There aren't a lot of dollar bills hanging on pine trees. It's harder to make money, not harder to make a living now. There's a difference. It's harder to make money in the country. It just is. I think the devil set that all up, by the way. So it's that way. People love malls. They love easy food. They used to have to go out and grub around and get their own food. Now you just go, the stores are just full of the stuff. You just have to have money, of course. Public utilities. They used to have to gather their own firewood. My, so nice to just flick a switch. Leisure time, entertainment. People love that. But there's a downside to all of this convenience, as you all know. The first, probably, and the most important is stress. People are so busy. You know, there's a famous saying, I forget who, should have looked this up, I suppose, who first said it, but said that a man who is in a hurry, forgive me, no man who is in a hurry is truly civilized. And you know, in a town, people just walked right by it. Everybody's in a hurry. Everybody's going somewhere. When I first moved to Polebridge area, where we are, you couldn't pass a car without stopping because you knew everybody. And you'd roll down the window and you'd both sit there and talk for 5 or 10 minutes. There were no phones at those days. And that's how you communicated. And finally somebody would come down the road and you'd have to move over and move on. Stress. There's another problem. Congestion. By their very nature, cities are congested places. If you pile more people into one place, you can extract more money out of more people in one day. Never forget that. Most people go to town thinking they're going to make more money, but actually everybody else is thinking the same thing, and unless you're really smart, you're going to end up parting with a lot of it to somebody else. That's what happens. There's stress involved. Congestion, of course. There's lack of privacy. That's becoming more of an issue, as you know, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Pollution, crime, and now I come to the really hard ones, absent fathers. And you know, today, I hate to say this, it's absent mothers, too. It's so, so true. Kids are off to school, they're in daycare, wherever, and they're both gone. Why are they both gone? More money. Is it really worth it? And then, of course, the worst consequence, the one a lot of people never think about, dependency. It used to be, when you moved to the country, what it meant was you had to do things for yourself. In town now, it's all being done. However, everything that you have is dependent on some organized system. And you kind of feel beholden to it, but people excuse it this way. The thinking goes like this. I need that city job to make the money, to pay the mortgage, buy the food, buy all those wonderful utilities, get all those wonderful consumer goods, especially those new electronic gadgets, and yes, probably even some toys I don't need. The result is that life is artificial, becomes spiritually draining. And I know that we all think it won't happen that way to us. And I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here because you're all here because you live in Cherryville, but I can see what's happened to even a lot of the folks I know about the city's kind of coming our way electronically, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. Often the result is that we may make more money, but our children tend to slip away, and we ourselves start to lose some of our ardent spirituality. You know, dependency is more important than we really realize. We've seen how the law of unintended consequences can work, and it's come full circle, but people do have more things today. They do have more money, but they also have less time. Usually less time for devotions, less time for their children. And that brings me to the second great law of life. And I call that well, it's really a whole phrase here. Listen carefully to it. We will eventually acquiesce to whatever power we become dependent on. I'll say that again. We will eventually acquiesce to whatever power we become dependent on. Now you may think, no matter what happens, I'll always stand for the Lord. Well, let me give you a little example of this from the modern world. You know that after the Second World War, the Soviets had to go through a lot of Eastern Europe to get to Germany, to end the war. They just didn't go home. And a Iron Curtain fell over Eastern Europe, and they kind of controlled the whole area. Russia became a very wealthy nation at that time in many ways, and they had this vast tundra area they couldn't do much with. But they discovered underneath it was what? Oil, and especially natural gas. In time, they began to pipe that natural gas all the way back to Western Europe, Germany, France, all those countries. Those countries were, they're not that big, and they didn't have that many resources, and it was kind of nice in those cold winters to have gas to heat your home, and so it all happened that way. They became dependent on that natural gas. So, just a year or so ago, what happens? Russia moves into Crimea, takes the land. They are now moving into Ukraine. They've taken about a third of the country. What have all those Western countries done? They've said, shouldn't do that. They've done virtually nothing. Why? Because they woke up on a cold December morning, they looked outside and they looked at the thermostat and they said, that might not be such a great move. And because they're dependent, they'll do nothing. Now, this is where it becomes serious. Even if we already live in the country, but we're still totally wired in and dependent on the world around us, that will be used as leverage, if possible, to get us to compromise. So there's many steps to country living, which we'll go over a little bit. So how do we get out of this? What's the way out? Really, the only way out of this is a complete change in lifestyle. Complete change in lifestyle. We learned when we first moved to the country, you can't just run to the mall or the store even to buy good things as you used to. You just don't have as much money. You can have as much money, but you're going to work just as much. I didn't want to work that much anymore. I wanted to spend time with my little girl. I wanted to spend time with my wife. I wanted to spend time canoeing and hiking and all that sort of thing too. And time is money, as you all know. To understand how we solve this problem, we have to know a little bit more about God's original plan. And I know you all know these stories, but maybe there's a few details that have escaped you as they had me. So turn your Bibles, if you would, to Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2. And I'm sorry, folks, I think Terry said not look at the clock, but I got way too much stuff here, so we'll have to move along very, very quickly. In chapter 2 of Genesis, looking in verse 8, it says the following. The Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man who he had formed. We know that. But it was God who planted it, not Adam, and he put the man there. And then look in verse 15. Then the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and keep it. Now I have a question for you. If people were perfect, which they were, Adam and Eve were perfect, right? They'd never sinned, nothing. Why'd they need to be in a garden environment? I mean, I know it's fun and all that, and the flowers are pretty. We often say, it's really better in the country for you spiritually because you might get tempted and all that. Well, why'd they need to be in the garden?
There wasn't any cities.
There weren't any cities, but the Lord could have created one, I suppose. Hey, it wasn't very long and there were cities. But the reason he put them there is because of what he had said in Genesis 1. And look in verse 26 and 27. Then God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish and so on. He wanted them to be in his likeness. And this is a point that I kind of missed for many years. Adam and Eve came, they were sinless, they were perfect, they had a perfect world around them, but they were missing one very important ingredient. They didn't have a character. Think about you. What would it have been like if you, as a full-grown man or woman, were just fell out of the sky and landed in this beautiful garden and you knew nothing? You'd never thought a thought before. You didn't know anything. You didn't even know about heaven. You didn't even know who created you. Now God came and told them a few things. But folks, you got to realize, until they chose on their own to worship God, not just because He asked them to, they were not safe, which the record proves. That's the way you and I are. Even though we become converted and God forgives all our sins, we're still not safe to save until we develop a Christ-like character, and that takes time. And what to do that, you must have a choice between something that's good and something that isn't, and you purposely, on your own, without any coercion, choose the right, and then your character begins to form. You choose again, and it forms some more. And eventually your character becomes fixed, and at that point, Ellen White tells us the whole tree of knowledge of good and evil would have just been transplanted out. They didn't need it anymore. But till that point, they needed it. So He placed them in a garden where they would have the best chance to see His created works on display everywhere. With living like that, how would you not say, I love this person who made all this? And Adam, He gave you to me, Eve. That's such a wonderful gift. If He hadn't done that, now think of us. We need it far more than they did, right? And yet, most people, as soon as they can, flee the Garden of Eden, heading for an urban environment because it's somehow going to be better for my family. Do you see the irony there and what's really going on and why most people don't want to do it? So we have to get to the place where we want to become like Him. We need to admire Him, love Him, develop an intelligent appreciation for Him. Turn quickly to 2 Chronicles, chapter 3, verse 18. But we all, with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as by the Spirit of the Lord. That brings me to the third great law of life. That law is, by beholding, you become changed. Listen to this short but incredible statement here by Ellen White. Beholding the scenes of nature, the works of the Creator, by studying God's handiwork, imperceptibly you will be changed into the same image. That's why a lot of people think you move to the country because you want to hole up and be ready for a coming crisis. Well, there's some truth to that. It's more fun. I want to go canoeing and whatnot with my kids. Now, the real reason is because whatever you surround yourself with, eventually you'll become like it. Even if you're there for a good reason, but you're in the wrong environment, if you stay there very long, you'll become like it. That happens over and over and over again. So, when man sinned, God had a new problem. And you remember, and I got to shorten this, basically what He told Adam is, what you need is a double dose of nature study. And so I'm going to make gardening a little tougher for you. But this time around, I want you to see in the natural world the effects of sin. So you don't have to experience it unless you're dumb enough to choose it. But you can see what happens, so thorns and thistles came along with it. And gardening got tougher. And most people, I've talked to people, why don't you garden more? I don't want to get dirty hands and my back aches a little bit and all those terrible weeds. And, there's thorns on the roses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just going to hire somebody to do that for me. There's a lot of people that don't mind picking all my lettuce for me in whatever places. And I'll just sit in a desk somewhere and make easy money. I'll just go buy it. But when you do that, you're avoiding the whole reason God asked us to actually grow our own food, because by so doing, we see in our own experience what sin has wrought, and we see God's creative power. That's the real reason why he asked people to do it. Now, when Cain killed his brother, there was a whole new level of problem here. And I want to read about that just a little bit. Look with me there back in Genesis. This is in chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4. And you know the story, so we won't go over too many of the details here. But after God had come down and talked to Cain a little bit, we get Cain's reaction. Now, remember, God's prescription for him was another dose of hard work in the garden, right? He cursed the ground again for Cain's sake. Here was what Cain did. Verse 16. Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord. That's a very important phrase there. He went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelled in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And he built a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Cain says, Lord, you're going to try and make me garden even more? And I got to, no way. I'm building a city. I'm going to get somebody else to do my gardening for me. That's what he did. And he named it after Enoch. And that is ironic, because I always think of Enoch as the other Enoch. And the other Enoch had a whole different idea. He did everything he could to walk with God. And eventually, his walk was perfect with God, and God translated him, and he is a symbol of what? Of who? Of God's people at the end of time who've come so close to him and admire him so much, they'll be translated without seeing death. This other Enoch, however, was the guy who, with his dad, started the first city. Now, what's the name Enoch mean? It means dedicated. The two were dedicated to two different principles. One was to staying in the natural world that God had created, so you could surround yourself with it and become so immersed in it, you were ready to go to God's house. The other was to get out of that environment, create your own environment, and live in a city. But it's even more important when you're Enoch. It says, to Enoch was born Irad. This is in verse 18. So this is now the grandson of Cain. And I had never seen this before. You know what Irad means? The name? It means town man. He was proud of the fact that he was a city slicker. You said it, that's right. I don't have to go out and get my hands dirty and do all this sort of stuff and get my own food. I don't need to do that. I'll get somebody else to do it for me. I don't have time. There's actually two other names there that are so important, but we don't have time to do that today. So, the Lord doubled down on trying to get people to actually do the only physical prescription the Lord ever gave to help us get out of sin. And what is that? Earn your bread by the sweat of your brow. And even you and me and my family, we didn't think that was important. I don't need to earn my bread. I love the Lord. Why do I need to garden? I have a postage stamp garden. I do a little bit. It's kind of fun. But really, I don't want to grow all my food. Do I really need to do that? When you think about that, that was Cain's attitude. And it's for that reason that we have lost so many of our own people. This isn't the only reason. There are many. I know there's entertainment, there's sports, there's everything else. But if you can get folks, and we learned this in our small academy that we ran in the wilderness, we would have kids come out there and they all came from good homes. That was our purpose. But they were so full of electronics and all the rest, good stuff. It took them a month or two in the wilderness to detox. We had no internet on purpose. No phone for years and years. Finally got like a radio phone, but you could only do it if you came to the living room and hooked up. And we had parents, so many would come to us and say, that's why we want to send them there. We want to get them out in the wilderness. Their minds are just so cluttered. Now, we got to be where we are to make the money, you understand. But we want our kids to be somewhere else. It was heartbreaking, really. It worked till they went back home, many of them. It has to be something that is a consistent lifestyle from A to Z, all the way through. Well, Cain wasn't really interested in that, and you know his story. I'm going to have to skip through some things here. I want you at this point, so you don't think this is all just coming from me, I'm just not that bright. I want to read you just a very, very few statements from the Spirit of Prophecy. Many of these you've heard, I'm sure, so there are hundreds of statements like this. Many of them are not in the one book, Country Living. There are other places. Some of these are, some of them are patriarchs and prophets and so on. So let me just read a few here. This one is from Country Living, page 5. In the beginning, He, God, placed our first parents amidst the beautiful sights and sounds He desires us to rejoice in today. The more nearly we come into harmony with God's original plan, the more favorable will be our position to secure health of body and mind and soul. We all know that. Instead of dwelling where only the works of man can be seen, where the sights and sounds frequently suggest thoughts of evil, go where you can look on the works of God, find rest of spirit in the beauty and quietude and peace of nature. Let the eye rest on the green fields, the groves, and the hills. Go where, apart from the distractions and dissipations of city life, you can give your children your companionship. That's what kids need today. They need mom and dad more than anything else. Tonight I want to talk a little more about that, because some of you may wonder, if I raise my children and they got to go out and weed in the garden and they're going to get dirty and they in our own experience, the question really becomes, what are the true principles that the Lord has really laid out for us? Why do we really need to do this? And the first principle, as we've said, is spiritual development. And here's why I want to point this out. Today, unlike in Ellen White's day or before, you can move to the country and you can take the city with you. Do you realize, I was reading this in a national magazine, this is a secular magazine now, the average person with a smartphone, this is the average now, looks at their phone 150 times a day. Oh, somebody oh, another text. I've been around people, and even good Christian people. They do. I don't know if it's 150 for all of them, but that's the average. You know how long that takes? If you just spend 1 minute each time, it's 100, that's 2 and some hours. And besides that, people spend hours, even out in the country, sitting in front of their computer on the internet. So I have a couple suggestions for us. Spend no more time on Facebook or any other social media than you spend on your knees, communicating with the only friend that will never let you down. Second suggestion, spend no more time on the internet, the rest of the internet, and I have to look at it some too. Terry even emailed me. It's terrible. One wilderness to the other. No more time on the internet, your computer, or other electronic gizmos, and they're proliferating like mice, okay? Than you spend in your garden. If you'll follow that rule, you'll have the most beautiful garden the world has ever seen, okay? The second principle of why you really need to get out there and garden is we need it for health. And I could go through the whole thing. You know how much money you'll save on gym equipment and gym memberships if you actually get your own firewood and grub out your own stumps? I don't have to go any further, do I? Fresh mountain air, pure water, garden produce. Oh, what's not to like? Well, I suppose the mosquitoes, foggy days, whatever. Third principle, we need more time for our families, especially today. And if your kids are already gone or you don't have your own children, hey, you got grandkids or your friend has grandchildren or children. Remember, if we just save all our own children, how many folks would there be in the church? Just remember that. It's so, so important. Okay. There's one more thing. The day's going to come, and you have to remember, we have to remember, because a lot of people think of country living as a bunker mentality. I'm going to go out, dig a big hole, pour a lot of concrete, store up a bunch of stuff, and I'm ready. I don't even own a gun. That's not the reason for country living. In fact, we're told don't store up things for the future. The only storing up you do is to put your potatoes in the root cellar so that they'll last till the next harvest. The Lord will bless that. But that's the reason. But the day is going to come, even though country living is God's plan. If the Lord wouldn't come for 100 more years, it's still the best plan. And I'm here to tell you that next to choosing Christ and each other, the best decision Linda and I ever made was to move to the country and actually quit our day jobs to do it at that time. It's the best decision for our own family and everything else. But we are told the day is going to come when one of the other principles of why we should be careful in how we conduct our country homes will come along. And let me just read a statement or two here. It says, find the right one. It says, many are unwilling to earn their bread by the sweat of their brow, and they refuse to till the soil. I've run into a few folks like that. I was kind of like that to start with. But the earth has blessings hidden in her depths for those who have courage and will and perseverance to gather her treasures. Again and again, the Lord has instructed that our people are to take their families away from the cities into the country, where they can raise their own provisions, for in the future, the problem of buying and selling will be a very serious one. So there's more to just location of a country home. We need to have it in the basics of life: shelter, food, water. Not all the luxuries. Those things, we must be producing those by depending on God. No one's going to become self-sufficient doing this. Don't realize, I hate that when people say, oh, you're going out to be self. No, I'm going out to depend on God rather than Costco. Sorry, Costco. That's the point. So the day is going to come, and I think it's coming soon. And you look at the world around it. I mean, you folks are, I'm sure, keep up with things. We have no idea how close we are to the end of time. We need to be in a position where we have a simple but elegant, protected country home where we can grow enough food for our basic needs. We can't grow everything that you might like. Peanut butter, peanuts don't grow well in Montana. I don't know about British Columbia. And I love peanut butter, but I'm not going to probably have it.
They don't do well here either.
Yeah, but potatoes do really well. I'm going to end up subsisting, as you'll see tonight, on fig and apricot smoothies, probably, and maybe a few other things. But we need to have an essential food supply. We need water that does not depend on some outside system to pump it for us, and so on and so forth. There's all kinds of good ideas that we can do. The Lord loves us. He wants us. Really, He wants us to be with Him. And you know, we're only preparing really for what's going to come when Jesus actually comes. And I want to finish with this statement. This is taken, by the way, from the book Prophets and Kings. In the earth made new, the redeemed will engage in the occupations and pleasures that brought happiness to Adam and Eve in the beginning. The Eden life will be lived, the life in garden and field. Often people think we go to heaven, we're going to be strumming harps and we're all going to be living in a nice big golden city. No. The Lord is consistent. As soon as we get to heaven, we'll have lots of fun things to do, don't get me wrong, but our basic lives can be the same. The life of garden and field. There, every power will be developed, every capability increased, the grandest enterprises will be carried forward. To us, who are standing on the very verge of their fulfillment, of what deep moment, what living interest are these delineations of things to come, events for which since our first parents turned their steps from Eden, God's children have watched and waited, longed and prayed. You know, my friends, I long to live the natural life in Eden restored. So let's all promise together, make a solemn promise to your family, to all of us today, that by God's grace and our loving response to His invitation, we'll all meet around the tree of life in the earth made new. Thank you.